Welcome back to Verified Fears. I'm your host, and today we're exploring one of America's most visited locations, Walmart. These aren't urban legends, but real accounts from real people who experienced something genuinely disturbing during routine shopping trips. I've collected hundreds of viewer submissions and selected 11 of the most chilling, verified stories. These range from threatening encounters and employee misconduct to mysterious disappearances and privacy violations. Each story is told in the first person, preserving the authentic voice of those who lived through these experiences. What makes these accounts particularly unsettling is their reminder that horror doesn't just happen in remote places. It can occur anywhere, even under the bright lights of your local store. So prepare yourself for 11 disturbing true Walmart horror stories that will make you think twice about your next shopping trip. These are the verified fears that lurk in everyday life. My name is Samantha, and I'm a 24-year-old elementary school teacher living in Phoenix, Arizona. What happened to me 6 months ago at the Walmart on 75th Avenue still gives me panic attacks, and I haven't been able to shop alone since. I'm sharing this story because I want other women to know that what happened to me could happen to anyone, and trusting your instincts might just save your life. It was a Sunday evening around 7 p.m., and I had just finished grading papers for my third grade class. I realized I was completely out of groceries and needed to make a quick run before the week started. I chose that particular Walmart because it's close to my apartment and usually not too crowded on Sunday nights. I remember feeling tired but looking forward to getting my shopping done efficiently so I could meal prep for the week ahead. The first time I noticed him, I was in the produce section picking out bananas. He was standing near the apples, maybe 15 feet away, wearing a faded Arizona Cardinals baseball cap pulled low over his face and a wrinkled flannel shirt that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. He was probably in his late 40s or early 50s, with graying stubble and hands that looked rough and weathered. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People shop for produce, that's normal. But something about the way he was staring made my skin crawl. He wasn't looking at the apples or comparing prices like normal shoppers do. He was looking directly at me with this intense, unwavering gaze that made me immediately uncomfortable. I quickly grabbed my bananas and moved to the bread aisle, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. But when I turned the corner, there he was again, now suddenly very interested in sandwich bread. My heart started beating a little faster, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just shopping the same route as me. These things happen in stores. I picked up a loaf of whole wheat bread and headed toward the cereal aisle, deliberately taking a longer path to see if he would follow. He did. Every single aisle I went to, he appeared within a minute or two. When I went to get breakfast cereal, he was examining granola bars with the same fake intensity. When I moved to the canned goods section, he was suddenly fascinated by pasta sauce. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore, and my hands started shaking as I realized this wasn't a coincidence. This man was deliberately following me through the store, and he was being obvious about it, like he wanted me to know. That's when the comments started. At first, they were quiet, almost whispered, but loud enough for me to hear clearly. I was reaching for a can of tomatoes when I heard his voice behind me say, "Nice jeans. They fit you real well." I froze, my hand still extended toward the shelf, not wanting to turn around and acknowledge what I'd heard. I pretended not to hear him and quickly grabbed the can, but my hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. I moved to the frozen food section, hoping the wider aisles and better lighting would make him back off. but it only seemed to embolden him. As I was looking at frozen vegetables, he positioned himself directly across from me and said, "I bet you live alone. Pretty girl like you, probably got a nice little apartment all to yourself." The way he said it made my blood run cold. It wasn't a question or casual conversation starter. It was a statement delivered with this knowing, predatory tone that suggested he was already thinking about what that information might mean. My fight-or-flight response was in full gear now. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and I was starting to feel lightheaded. I abandoned my cart and walked quickly toward the pharmacy section, thinking that maybe the presence of a pharmacist and the more clinical environment would deter him. But he followed me there too. And that's when his behavior escalated to something truly frightening. He started offering to help me, but in a way that felt more like veiled threats than genuine assistance. "You look like you're having trouble reaching those high shelves," he said, even though I wasn't reaching for anything high. "I could help you with that. I could help you with a lot of things." When I continued to ignore him, his voice took on an edge of irritation. "It's rude to ignore someone who's trying to be nice to you. I'm just being friendly." The word friendly coming from his mouth made my skin crawl. There was nothing friendly about the way he was stalking me through the store, making unsolicited comments about my body and living situation. I realized I needed to get help immediately. I walked as quickly as I could to the customer service desk at the front of the store, with him following about 10 feet behind me the entire way. The customer service representative was a young woman, maybe a few years older than me. And when I explained what was happening, I could see the concern in her eyes. She told me they would keep an eye out and asked if I wanted them to call security. I said yes, absolutely. But then she explained that their security guard wouldn't be back from his break for another 20 minutes. 20 minutes felt like an eternity when I was being stalked by someone who was becoming increasingly aggressive. While I was talking to the customer service representative, I could see him lurking near the electronics section, pretending to look at phones, but clearly watching our conversation. The representative suggested I wait in the customer service area until security returned, but I could see him moving closer, and I didn't feel safe staying in the store any longer. I made the decision to leave immediately. Even though it meant abandoning all my groceries and wasting the time I'd spent shopping, the walk to the exit felt like the longest walk of my life. I was trying to move quickly without running, not wanting to cause a scene, but desperately wanting to get to my car. I could hear his footsteps behind me, matching my pace. When I reached the automatic doors, I heard him say, "Leaving so soon? I thought we were having a nice conversation." The casual tone of his voice, as if we were old friends, was perhaps the most unsettling part of the entire encounter. I practically ran to my car, fumbling with my keys because my hands were shaking so badly. As I was pulling out of the parking space, I looked toward the store entrance and saw him standing there under the lights, just watching me leave. He wasn't trying to hide or pretend he was doing something else. He was just standing there, staring at my car as I drove away. The image of him standing there, backlit by the store's fluorescent lights with that baseball cap pulled low over his face, is burned into my memory. When I got home, I immediately called the police to report the incident. The officer I spoke with was sympathetic, but explained that since the man hadn't actually threatened me with violence or touched me, there wasn't much they could do legally. He took down my report and said they would increase patrols around that Walmart. But he also warned me that this type of behavior often escalates and advised me to be extra cautious about my personal safety. The next day, I called the Walmart corporate customer service line to follow up on the incident. They transferred me between several departments before I finally spoke with someone in their security division. They claimed they would review the security footage and take appropriate action. But when I called back a week later for an update, they said they had no record of my complaint. It was as if the whole thing had never happened. The psychological impact of this experience has been far more lasting than I initially expected. I developed severe anxiety about shopping alone, especially in large stores with multiple aisles where someone could easily follow you without being noticed. I started having panic attacks in grocery stores, feeling like I was being watched even when I logically knew I was safe. I had to start shopping with friends or family members, which made simple errands much more complicated and time-consuming. I also became hyper-vigilant about my surroundings in ways that were exhausting. I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, memorizing the faces of people around me, and planning escape routes whenever I entered public spaces. The carefree attitude I once had about running errands was completely gone, replaced by a constant state of alertness that left me emotionally and physically drained. 6 months later, I still shop at a different Walmart across town, even though it's less convenient. I never go shopping alone in the evening anymore, and I always park as close to the entrance as possible under the brightest lights available. I've taken a self-defense class and now carry pepper spray, not because I think it will definitely protect me, but because it gives me some sense of control in a situation where I felt completely powerless. What disturbs me most about this experience isn't just what happened to me, but the realization of how vulnerable we all are in these everyday spaces we consider safe. A routine grocery shopping trip turned into a terrifying encounter with someone who clearly had predatory intentions. And the systems that are supposed to protect customers, security, management, even law enforcement, felt inadequate to address the situation effectively. I'm sharing this story because I want other women to trust their instincts when something feels wrong. That uncomfortable feeling I had when I first noticed him staring was my intuition trying to protect me. And I'm grateful I listened to it instead of dismissing it as paranoia. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, don't worry about being polite or avoiding a scene. Your safety is more important than social conventions, and anyone who makes you feel unsafe in a public space is counting on your reluctance to make a fuss. My name is Carson, and I'm a 39-year-old IT specialist working in Houston, Texas. I consider myself a pretty level-headed person, having worked in corporate environments for over 15 years, and I don't typically get rattled by much. But what I witnessed on a Tuesday evening at the Walmart Supercenter on Westheimer Road fundamentally changed how I view the thin veneer of civilization that keeps our society functioning. This incident happened 8 months ago, but I still think about it regularly because it demonstrated just how quickly normal, everyday people can transform into something genuinely dangerous over the most trivial circumstances. It was approximately 6:30 p.m. on a weekday, and I had stopped at Walmart after work to pick up a few essentials: printer paper for my home office, some groceries for dinner, and a birthday card for my nephew. The parking lot was moderately busy, which is typical for that time of day when people are stopping by after work. I had parked toward the back of the lot where there were more available spaces. And I was walking back to my car with my purchases when I noticed a situation developing near the front entrance. There was an elderly man, probably in his 70s, who was slowly loading groceries into the trunk of his blue sedan. He moved deliberately, the way older people often do when they're being careful with heavy bags and don't want to strain themselves. His car was parked in one of the closer spots to the entrance, which makes sense for someone his age. Behind him, a white SUV was waiting with its turn signal on, positioned to take his spot once he left. The driver was a woman in her 40s with short blonde hair, and she appeared patient, waiting calmly, while the elderly man organized his groceries. From the opposite direction, a red pickup truck suddenly came around the corner and stopped, blocking the lane. The driver immediately started honking his horn aggressively, not the polite beep you might use to get someone's attention, but long, sustained honks that were clearly meant to be confrontational. The man driving the pickup was probably in his 30s, heavyset, wearing a baseball cap and what looked like work clothes. He rolled down his window and started shouting that the parking spot was his because he had been circling the lot longer and had seen it first. The woman in the SUV got out and tried to explain that she had been waiting there with her turn signal on, which anyone could see established her claim to the spot. Her voice was raised, but still reasonable at this point. The kind of tone you'd use when trying to resolve a misunderstanding with a difficult person. She pointed to her turn signal, which was still blinking, and gestured toward the elderly man who was clearly still in the process of loading his car. That's when the situation escalated beyond anything I could have anticipated. The pickup truck driver got out of his vehicle, and I immediately noticed he was carrying something in his right hand. It took me a moment to process what I was seeing, but it was a tire iron, one of those L-shaped metal tools used to change tires. He wasn't just holding it casually, he was gripping it like a weapon, and the way he was swinging it slightly as he walked made his intentions clear. The elderly man noticed what was happening and started moving faster, clearly frightened by the aggressive behavior unfolding around his car. He was fumbling with his grocery bags, trying to close his trunk, and I could see his hands shaking from where I was standing about 30 yards away. The woman from the SUV saw the tire iron and started backing toward her vehicle. Her demeanor completely changed from annoyed to genuinely scared. The pickup truck driver started yelling profanities, claiming that people needed to learn respect and that he wasn't going to be pushed around by some entitled woman. The language he was using was vile, filled with misogynistic slurs that made it clear his anger went far beyond a simple parking dispute. He was advancing toward the woman with the tire iron raised, and I realized I was potentially witnessing the buildup to a serious assault. I immediately pulled out my phone to call 911, but before I could even dial, I saw 2 security guards running toward the situation from the store entrance. I thought this would de-escalate things quickly, but what happened next was almost as disturbing as the initial confrontation. Instead of focusing on the man with the weapon, who was clearly the aggressor, the security guards seemed more concerned about preventing any liability for the store than actually protecting anyone. One of the guards positioned himself between the pickup truck driver and the woman, but instead of demanding that the man put down the tire iron, he started asking everyone to calm down and move their vehicles. The other guard was talking to the elderly man, seemingly more focused on getting him to leave quickly than ensuring his safety. Neither guard made any attempt to confiscate the weapon or even acknowledge that someone was brandishing a tire iron in a threatening manner. The pickup truck driver took this as validation of his position. He started getting louder, claiming that the security guards could see he was in the right and that the woman needed to move her car immediately. The tire iron was still in his hand, and he was gesturing with it while he spoke, making everyone in the vicinity nervous. Several other customers had stopped to watch, creating a crowd that seemed to feed his sense of being justified in his actions. The woman, realizing that the security guards weren't going to effectively protect her and that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, made the decision to get back in her SUV and leave. But the pickup truck driver wasn't satisfied with just getting the parking spot. As she was backing out, he approached her vehicle and used the tire iron to scrape a long gouge along the side of her SUV, from the front door to the rear wheel well. The sound of metal scraping against metal was horrific, and the deliberate nature of the vandalism was shocking. He wasn't acting in a moment of rage. He was calmly and methodically damaging her vehicle while making eye contact with her through the window. The woman was clearly terrified, and I could see her on her phone, presumably calling the police while trying to navigate around his truck to get out of the parking lot. The security guards did nothing to stop the vandalism. They just stood there watching as this man deliberately destroyed someone's property in broad daylight in front of multiple witnesses. One of them even seemed to be trying to position himself so that the store's security cameras wouldn't have a clear view of what was happening, which suggested they were more concerned about the store being implicated than about preventing a crime. The elderly man had finally managed to get his groceries loaded and was desperately trying to get out of the situation. His hands were visibly shaking as he closed his trunk and walked around to his driver's side door. The pickup truck driver, apparently satisfied with having claimed his prize, was now yelling at the old man to hurry up and move. The poor man was so rattled that he dropped his car keys twice before managing to get into his vehicle. As the elderly man pulled away, I could see the relief on his face, but also something that looked like trauma. This was someone's grandfather who had just wanted to buy groceries and instead found himself in the middle of a violent confrontation that easily could have resulted in serious injury or death. The casual way the pickup truck driver had brandished that tire iron suggested he was comfortable with the threat of violence, and I couldn't help wondering how many other people he had intimidated in similar situations. The pickup truck driver parked in the contested spot and walked into the store as if nothing had happened. No consequences, no police intervention, no accountability whatsoever. The security guards dispersed, and the crowd of onlookers gradually went back to their shopping. Within 5 minutes, it was like the entire incident had never occurred, except for the elderly man who was probably still shaken and the woman whose vehicle had been vandalized. I waited in the parking lot until the police arrived, having called 911 after the situation had resolved. I gave them a detailed statement and provided my contact information as a witness. The officer who took my report seemed frustrated, but not surprised, explaining that road rage and parking lot confrontations were becoming increasingly common and violent. He said they would review the store's security footage and try to identify the pickup truck driver, but he didn't sound optimistic about the chances of any real consequences. When I called the police department a week later to follow up, I was told that the store claimed their security cameras had malfunctioned during the time of the incident and no usable footage was available. The pickup truck's license plate number that I had provided didn't match any vehicle registered in Texas, suggesting it might have been stolen or altered. The case was essentially dead in the water. This experience changed my perspective on public safety and human nature in ways I'm still processing. I realized that the social contracts we rely on, basic civility, respect for others' property, appropriate response to conflict, are much more fragile than I had assumed. I saw how quickly someone could escalate from annoyance to genuine violence over something as meaningless as a parking spot, and how inadequately our systems are equipped to handle such situations. The incident also made me hyper-aware of my own vulnerability in everyday situations. I now pay much more attention to the people around me when I'm out in public, looking for signs of agitation or potential aggression. I park further away from store entrances to avoid competitive situations, and I'm much more willing to de-escalate or walk away from conflicts that previously I might have stood my ground on. What disturbs me most is the realization that this could happen anywhere, at any time, involving anyone. The pickup truck driver looked like a normal person until he revealed his capacity for violence and property destruction. The security guards appeared professional until they demonstrated their unwillingness to actually provide security. The elderly man was just trying to live his life until he became collateral damage in someone else's rage. I still shop at that Walmart occasionally, but I'm always scanning the parking lot for potential conflicts. And I've never again assumed that the presence of security guards means I'm actually safe. This is Neve, and I'm a 19-year-old college student at Arizona State University in Chandler. I work part-time at a local restaurant that closes at midnight, so I'm used to being out late and seeing some pretty interesting characters during the late-night hours. But what I witnessed at the 24-hour Walmart on Alma School Road fundamentally challenged my understanding of what normal human behavior looks like. And it left me questioning whether some people are just fundamentally different from the rest of us in ways that can't be explained by mental illness or substance abuse alone. This happened about 4 months ago on a Thursday night, or technically Friday morning, around 1:30 a.m. I had just gotten off work and needed to pick up some groceries for the weekend since I wouldn't have time to shop during normal hours. I actually prefer shopping late at night because the stores are quieter, there are no crowds, and you can move through the aisles at your own pace without dealing with long checkout lines or screaming children. The late-night crowd at Walmart is usually pretty harmless. Other night shift workers, college students like me, and the occasional insomniac picking up necessities. When I first walked into the store, everything seemed normal. The overnight crew was restocking shelves. There were maybe a dozen other customers scattered throughout the store. And the fluorescent lighting created that familiar, slightly surreal late-night atmosphere that I'd grown accustomed to. I grabbed a shopping cart and headed toward the grocery section, planning to quickly pick up milk, bread, some frozen meals for the week, and maybe some snacks for studying. That's when I first noticed her. She was standing in the produce section, but she wasn't shopping in any conventional sense. She was a woman who appeared to be in her 50s, wearing a faded hospital gown that looked like it had been worn for days and a pair of house slippers that were completely inappropriate for being out in public. Her gray hair was uncombed and had that matted look that comes from not washing it for an extended period. But what struck me most was her posture and movement patterns. She was swaying slightly, almost rhythmically, like she was listening to music that only she could hear. Initially, I thought maybe she was a patient who had wandered away from a nearby hospital or care facility. Arizona has several medical centers in the area, and it wouldn't be completely unprecedented for a confused patient to end up in a public place. I considered whether I should alert store security or offer to help her, but something about her behavior made me hesitate. She didn't seem distressed or lost in the way you'd expect from someone with dementia or a similar condition. Instead, she appeared to be purposefully engaged in some kind of activity that made sense to her, even if it looked bizarre to outside observers. As I continued shopping, I kept encountering her in different sections of the store, and I began to notice a disturbing pattern in her behavior. She was methodically opening packages of various items, food products, toys, electronics, household goods, and removing small objects from each package. She would carefully extract whatever item caught her interest, examine it closely, sometimes smell it or hold it up to the light, and then place it in the pockets of her hospital gown. After taking what she wanted, she would meticulously reseal the packages using what appeared to be clear tape that she carried with her. The resealing process was what made her behavior particularly unsettling. This wasn't random shoplifting or impulsive theft. She had come prepared with supplies and a system. She would smooth down the tape carefully, trying to make the packages look unopened, and then arrange them back on the shelves exactly where she had found them. Someone casually browsing would have no idea that the packages had been tampered with. It was methodical, premeditated and executed with a level of skill that suggested she had done this many times before. But the theft wasn't the most disturbing aspect of her behavior. Throughout this entire process, she was having animated conversations with someone who clearly wasn't there. These weren't the mumbled, incoherent ramblings you might expect from someone experiencing a psychotic episode. These were full, coherent conversations, with distinct pauses for responses, changes in tone indicating she was reacting to what her invisible companion was saying, and even moments where she would laugh at apparent jokes. I found myself following her at a distance, partly out of morbid curiosity and partly because I was trying to decide whether I should report what I was seeing. In the toy section, she opened a package of small plastic action figures and removed one that appeared to be a soldier or police officer. She held it up to her face and said, in a voice that was clearly audible to me from about 10 feet away, "Yes, I know you've been waiting for him. He looks just like Daddy, doesn't he?" Then she paused, as if listening to a response, and replied, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Daddy's coming home soon. He just has to finish his work first." The conversation continued as she moved through the store. She would periodically address her invisible companion with terms of endearment. "Sweetie, honey, my little angel." And her voice would take on the gentle, nurturing tone that a mother might use with a young child. But interspersed with these tender moments were conversations that seemed to be with an adult, possibly a romantic partner, where her voice would become more intimate and occasionally flirtatious. In the electronics section, she opened a package of earbuds and removed one, placing it in her ear as if she was listening to something. She started swaying more dramatically, sometimes moving her lips as if she was singing along to music. Then she would stop, remove the earbud, and have a conversation about the song she had just heard, discussing the lyrics and melody with her invisible companion as if they were sharing a romantic moment. The most disturbing incident occurred in the food section. She opened a package of cookies, took out several pieces, and began having what appeared to be a family dinner conversation. She would take a bite of cookie, chew thoughtfully, and then comment on how delicious it was and how happy she was that everyone could be together for dinner. She would pause to listen to other family members sharing details about their day, responding with appropriate maternal concern and encouragement. At one point, she looked directly toward an empty space next to her and said, "Oh, honey, you don't need to worry about the bills this month. I found some extra money, and everything is going to be fine." Then she reached into her pocket, pulled out what appeared to be a few crumpled dollar bills, and placed them on an empty shelf as if she was contributing to a family fund. I finally decided I needed to report what I was seeing, partly because of the theft, but mostly because I was concerned about her welfare. I found a store employee, a young man who was restocking shelves in the pharmacy section, and explained what I had witnessed. His reaction was not what I expected. Instead of seeming surprised or concerned, he just nodded wearily and said, "Oh, that's Margaret. She comes in a few times a week." When I pressed him for more details, explaining that she was clearly stealing merchandise and might need medical assistance, he seemed reluctant to discuss the situation. He eventually admitted that the store management was aware of the situation, but that they had decided not to pursue any legal action. He said something about her not really hurting anyone, and that the items she took were small things that didn't significantly impact the store's inventory. This response troubled me almost as much as Margaret's behavior itself. The employee's casual attitude suggested that this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather an ongoing situation that the store had chosen to ignore. I asked if anyone had ever tried to get her help or contact social services, and he just shrugged and said that wasn't his job. I continued watching Margaret for another 20 minutes, documenting her behavior in my mind because I was considering making a more formal report to authorities. The pattern continued. She would open packages, remove small items, reseal everything carefully, and have conversations with invisible people throughout the process. Her movements were deliberate and purposeful, suggesting a level of cognitive function that made her situation even more puzzling. As I was finally ready to check out and leave, I saw her in the parking lot under one of the bright security lights. She was standing perfectly still, looking up at the sky, having what appeared to be an intense conversation with someone. Her body language suggested she was arguing or pleading, with her hands gesturing emphatically and her voice occasionally rising to a level I could hear from inside the store. When I walked to my car, I could hear fragments of what she was saying. She was talking about coming home, about promises that had been broken, and about waiting for someone who never arrived. The pain in her voice was unmistakable, and for the first time during this entire encounter, she sounded genuinely distressed rather than engaged in pleasant conversation. I later learned from a friend who works at that Walmart that Margaret's husband had died in a car accident about 2 years ago, and she had been living in her car ever since, unable to accept his death. The employees knew her story and had made an unofficial decision to let her take small items because they felt sorry for her situation. The conversations she was having were with her deceased husband and the children they had never been able to have together. This knowledge made the entire experience even more heartbreaking. But it also raised questions about how we as a society handle people who are struggling with grief and mental health issues. Margaret wasn't hurting anyone in a conventional sense, but she clearly needed help that she wasn't receiving. The store's decision to ignore her behavior rather than connect her with appropriate services seemed like a form of enabling that wasn't ultimately helping her heal or move forward. The incident changed my perspective on the complexity of human behavior and the fine line between compassion and neglect when dealing with people who are suffering in ways that don't fit neatly into standard categories of mental illness or criminal behavior. My name is Hunter, and I'm a 37-year-old contractor who works mainly on residential construction projects around Mesa, Arizona. My job requires me to start early, usually around 5:30 a.m., so I often find myself needing to pick up supplies or groceries during off hours when most people are either at work or asleep. I've always been comfortable shopping late at night. I'm a pretty big guy. I'm aware of my surroundings, and I generally don't worry too much about personal safety in well-lit public places. But what happened to me at the Walmart on Southern Avenue completely changed how I think about vulnerability and the predatory behavior that can hide behind a friendly, helpful facade. This incident took place about 6 months ago on a Wednesday night around 2:45 a.m. I'd been working on a kitchen renovation that was running behind schedule, and I needed to pick up some electrical supplies and grab some food for the next day since I wouldn't have time to stop anywhere during normal business hours. The 24-hour Walmart was my go-to option for these late-night runs because they usually have everything I need in one place, and the store is generally quiet enough that I can get in and out quickly without dealing with crowds or long checkout lines. When I entered the store, it had that typical late-night atmosphere. Dimmed lighting in some sections, the overnight crew restocking shelves with their industrial equipment, and maybe 8 or 10 other customers scattered throughout the massive space. Most of the other shoppers appeared to be night shift workers like myself, college students, or people who simply prefer to avoid daytime crowds. The environment felt familiar and comfortable, exactly what I expected from countless previous late-night shopping trips. I headed straight to the hardware section to look for the electrical components I needed for my project. That's where I first encountered him. A Walmart employee who appeared to be in his early 20s, thin build, wearing the standard blue vest with a name tag that I later realized said Derek. He approached me with what initially seemed like standard customer service, asking if I needed help finding anything specific. I explained that I was looking for some particular gauge wire and electrical boxes, and he offered to show me exactly where those items were located. His helpfulness seemed genuine at first, and I appreciated having someone who knew the store layout guide me directly to what I needed instead of wandering around trying to locate items in unfamiliar sections. He walked with me to the electrical supplies, pointing out different options and even offering some advice about which brands he thought were better quality. His knowledge seemed legitimate, and his demeanor was friendly and professional. I thanked him for his assistance and expected him to return to whatever tasks he had been working on before I arrived. But Derek didn't leave. Instead, he continued following me as I moved through the store, maintaining what he claimed was casual conversation, but gradually becoming more intrusive with his questions. He started asking about my work, what kind of projects I was working on, where the job sites were located, what my schedule looked like. Initially, I assumed this was just friendly small talk, the kind of conversation you might have with someone who seemed interested in construction work or was considering a career change. However, his questions became increasingly specific and personal. He wanted to know what time I usually finished work, whether I lived alone, what kind of vehicle I drove, and whether I had family in the area. When I began giving shorter, less detailed answers, clearly trying to redirect the conversation or end it altogether, he didn't take the hint. Instead, he became more persistent, following me into each new section of the store and continuing to probe for personal information. The situation took a distinctly unsettling turn when I noticed Derek was carrying a small, handheld device that looked like a scanner or inventory tracker. Every time I picked up an item to examine it, he would point the device in my direction and appear to be recording something. When I asked him about it, he claimed he was doing inventory management and that he needed to track which items customers were showing interest in for some kind of corporate analysis program. His explanation didn't make sense to me. I've worked with enough retail businesses to understand basic inventory procedures, and what he was describing wasn't consistent with any standard practices I was familiar with. More importantly, I noticed that he wasn't scanning the actual items I was picking up. He was pointing the device at me personally, and the timing of his actions corresponded more with my movements than with any merchandise I was handling. My suspicion that something wasn't right intensified when I caught Derek taking pictures of me with his personal cell phone. I was in the automotive section looking at some tools when I noticed him standing at the end of the aisle, holding his phone up and clearly photographing me. When our eyes met and he realized I had seen what he was doing, he quickly put the phone away and approached me with some fabricated excuse about documenting suspicious customer behavior for loss prevention purposes. This explanation was obviously false for multiple reasons. First, I wasn't engaging in any behavior that could remotely be considered suspicious. I was shopping normally, examining products I was considering purchasing, and moving through the store in a straightforward manner. Second, if there were genuine concerns about customer behavior, those would be handled through official security protocols, not by a regular employee taking personal photos with his own device. Third, his demeanor and body language suggested he knew he had been caught doing something inappropriate. When I confronted Derek directly about the photography and asked to speak with a manager, his attitude became defensive and slightly aggressive. He claimed that I had been acting erratically since I entered the store, and that he was following standard procedures for monitoring potentially problematic customers. He said that my questions about his inventory scanning activities were evidence that I was trying to case the store for shoplifting or some other criminal activity. These accusations were not only false, but also seemed designed to make me doubt my own perception of what was happening. Derek was essentially gaslighting me, trying to convince me that normal shopping behavior was suspicious and that his inappropriate surveillance was justified. The fact that he had ready explanations for his actions suggested that he had used these tactics before, possibly with other customers who might have been less willing or able to push back against his behavior. I insisted on speaking with a manager and made it clear that I wasn't going to continue shopping until the situation was resolved. Derek reluctantly called for a manager over his radio, but the wait time was longer than it should have been for what was supposedly a routine request. During the 15 minutes I waited, Derek remained nearby, continuing to watch me and occasionally speaking into his radio in a way that suggested he was providing his version of events to whoever was responding. When the night manager finally arrived, Derek immediately launched into a detailed account of my supposedly suspicious behavior. He claimed that I had been asking unusual questions about store security, that I had been examining products without any apparent intention to purchase them, and that I had become hostile when he tried to provide customer service. He presented the photographs on his phone as evidence of my erratic behavior, framing his surveillance as a proactive security measure. The manager's response was disappointing and concerning. Rather than questioning why an employee was taking unauthorized photos of customers or investigating Derek's claims, she seemed to accept his account without scrutiny. She asked to see my identification, requested that I empty my pockets to prove I wasn't shoplifting, and even suggested that I might be under the influence of drugs or alcohol based on Derek's assessment of my behavior. I was forced to submit to what amounted to an impromptu interrogation and search, despite having done nothing wrong and having no legal obligation to comply with these requests. The manager examined my identification, asked detailed questions about why I was shopping so late at night, and even requested to see receipts for items I had purchased at that same store during previous visits that happened to still be in my vehicle. The entire process was humiliating and invasive, conducted in full view of other customers who were clearly wondering what kind of criminal activity I had been caught engaging in. The manager and Derek were creating a public spectacle that damaged my reputation and caused me significant embarrassment, all based on completely fabricated accusations of suspicious behavior. After approximately 30 minutes of this treatment, during which they found no evidence of any wrongdoing because I hadn't committed any, I was finally told that I was free to continue shopping, but that they would be keeping an eye on me for the remainder of my visit. The clear implication was that I was still considered a potential threat despite their complete inability to justify that assessment. I chose to leave the store immediately rather than continue shopping under surveillance. As I was walking toward the exit, I overheard Derek speaking with another employee, saying something about how you have to watch out for guys like that and trust your instincts when someone seems off. He was portraying himself as a vigilant employee who had successfully identified and neutralized a potential threat, when in reality he had been engaging in inappropriate surveillance and harassment of an innocent customer. I filed a formal complaint with Walmart Corporate the next day, providing detailed accounts of Derek's behavior and the manager's inadequate response. I also reported the incident to local police, though they explained that since no actual crime had been committed, their options for investigation were limited. The corporate response was a generic acknowledgement that they would look into the matter. But I never received any follow-up communication about what action, if any, was taken. Several weeks later, I learned from another customer that Derek had been terminated. but not specifically for the incident involving me. Apparently, multiple customers had complained about similar experiences: unauthorized photography, invasive questioning, false accusations of suspicious behavior, and inappropriate surveillance. The pattern of behavior suggested that Derek had been systematically targeting late-night shoppers, possibly building some kind of database or engaging in activities that went well beyond normal employee duties. This experience fundamentally changed how I approach late-night shopping and my interactions with retail employees. I now realize that the vulnerability I felt wasn't just about being targeted by Derek's inappropriate behavior, but about how easily that behavior was legitimized and supported by management when it should have been immediately recognized as unacceptable. My name is Ember, and I'm a 22-year-old barista working at a local coffee shop in Phoenix, Arizona. I've always considered myself someone who tries to see the best in people and give others the benefit of the doubt. But what happened to me at the Walmart on 19th Avenue 6 months ago opened my eyes to the reality of how quickly prejudice and discrimination can turn a routine shopping trip into a humiliating and potentially dangerous situation. I'm sharing this story because I believe people need to understand how systemic bias operates in everyday spaces and how easily someone can become a victim of profiling based on nothing more than their appearance and assumptions about their background. This incident occurred on a Saturday afternoon around 2 p.m. I'd just gotten off work from my morning shift at the coffee shop and needed to pick up some groceries and household items before meeting friends later that evening. I was dressed casually in jeans, a vintage band t-shirt, and sneakers. Nothing that should have attracted any particular attention. I'm a young black woman with natural hair that I wear in protective styles, and I've always been conscious of how I present myself in public spaces, especially in retail environments where I know some people might make assumptions about my intentions or character. The Walmart was moderately busy with typical Saturday afternoon shoppers. Families with children, elderly couples, college students, and working people running errands on their day off. I grabbed a shopping cart and started with the grocery section, planning to work my way through the store systematically to get everything on my list. I was in no hurry and was actually enjoying having some time to browse and compare prices on items I didn't usually have time to research during busier weekdays. I first noticed the loss prevention officer when I was in the produce section. He was a large white man, probably in his 40s, with a shaved head and an aggressive posture that immediately made me uncomfortable. He was standing near the bananas, but he wasn't shopping or even pretending to look at the fruit. He was staring directly at me with an intensity that felt threatening and inappropriate. When I moved to look at vegetables, he followed, positioning himself where he could maintain visual contact while trying to appear casual about his surveillance. Initially, I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid or overly sensitive. Loss prevention officers do need to monitor customers, and maybe he was just doing his job in a way that happened to make me uncomfortable. But as I continued shopping, his behavior became increasingly obvious and intrusive. He was following me through every section of the store, staying approximately 10 to 15 feet behind me, and making no effort to disguise his surveillance or engage in any activities that would justify his presence in each area. Other customers began to notice what was happening. I could see people glancing between the loss prevention officer and me, clearly wondering what I had done to warrant such intensive monitoring. Some shoppers seemed to instinctively give me more space, as if they assumed I must be dangerous or likely to engage in criminal behavior based on the attention I was receiving from security. The social dynamics were creating a feedback loop where the surveillance was generating suspicion among other customers, which then seemed to justify even more intensive monitoring. The situation escalated when I reached the electronics section. I was looking at phone chargers, comparing prices and reading product specifications when the loss prevention officer approached me directly for the first time. He positioned himself very close to me, invading my personal space in a way that felt intimidating, and demanded to know what I was doing in that section of the store. His tone was accusatory and aggressive, as if I had already been caught doing something wrong. I explained that I was shopping for a phone charger, which should have been self-evident given that I was standing in front of a display of phone accessories with my shopping cart beside me. But instead of accepting this reasonable explanation, he began questioning me about whether I actually owned a phone that would require the type of charger I was examining. He asked to see my phone, demanded to know why I needed a new charger, and questioned whether I had the money to pay for the item I was considering. These questions were inappropriate, invasive, and clearly motivated by assumptions about my economic status and likelihood to shoplift based on nothing more than my race and age. The loss prevention officer was treating me like a criminal suspect rather than a paying customer, and his behavior was creating a public spectacle that was drawing attention from other shoppers and store employees. When I attempted to continue shopping and move away from the confrontation, the loss prevention officer followed me and called for backup over his radio. Within minutes, 2 additional store employees arrived, another security guard and someone who appeared to be a floor supervisor. Rather than de-escalating the situation or investigating whether there was any legitimate basis for the surveillance, they seemed to automatically assume that the loss prevention officer's suspicions were justified. The 3 employees surrounded me in a way that was clearly designed to prevent me from leaving the area. They were positioning themselves strategically, blocking potential exit routes while maintaining the pretense of casual conversation. The supervisor began asking me questions about my shopping intentions, how long I planned to be in the store, and whether I had purchased anything yet. These questions had no legitimate purpose other than to intimidate me and gather information that could potentially be used against me later. I realized that I was being systematically profiled and harassed, and I decided to assert my rights as a customer. I asked to speak with a manager and requested an explanation for why I was being subjected to this treatment when I had done nothing wrong. I pointed out that I had been shopping normally, that I had made no attempt to conceal any activities, and that there was no reasonable basis for the intensive surveillance I had been receiving. The employee's response was to become more aggressive and defensive. The original loss prevention officer claimed that I had been acting suspiciously since entering the store, though he couldn't provide any specific examples of suspicious behavior when pressed for details. The supervisor suggested that my attitude and resistance to simple questions were evidence that I was hiding something and that cooperation with their investigation would be in my best interest. This was clearly an attempt to gaslight me into accepting treatment that I knew was inappropriate and discriminatory. They were trying to make me believe that normal shopping behavior was suspicious, that asking questions about my treatment was evidence of guilt, and that I had some obligation to submit to their investigation even though they had no legal authority to detain or interrogate me. The situation reached its peak when they insisted on checking my receipt and searching my bags, even though I had not yet made any purchases and therefore had no receipt to provide. When I pointed out this obvious logical flaw in their request, they claimed that I must have hidden items somewhere in the store, and that they needed to search my personal belongings to ensure I wasn't shoplifting. At this point, I was surrounded by 3 store employees, in full view of dozens of other customers who had stopped their own shopping to watch the confrontation unfold. I was being treated like a criminal suspect in a public space, based on no evidence whatsoever. And the employees were acting as if their behavior was completely normal and justified. The humiliation was overwhelming, and I could feel my heart racing as I realized how powerless I was in this situation. I agreed to the bag search because I knew I had nothing to hide and because I wanted to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. The loss prevention officer went through my purse methodically, examining every item and even questioning me about the purpose of various personal belongings. He seemed disappointed when he found nothing incriminating, as if he had been expecting to discover evidence that would validate his initial suspicions. After finding no evidence of any wrongdoing, the employees didn't apologize or acknowledge that their treatment of me had been inappropriate. Instead, they acted as if the search had been a routine security procedure and told me I was free to continue shopping. The implication was that they had done me a favor by clearing me of suspicion, rather than acknowledging that they had subjected me to discriminatory treatment based on racial profiling. I left the store immediately without making any purchases. I was too shaken and angry to continue shopping, and I didn't trust that the harassment wouldn't continue if I stayed. As I was walking to my car, I could see the loss prevention officer watching me through the store windows, as if he was still hoping to catch me doing something wrong that would justify his behavior. The psychological impact of this experience was significant and lasting. I felt violated, humiliated, and angry about being targeted for discrimination in such a public and degrading way. The incident made me hyper-aware of how I'm perceived in retail spaces and forced me to modify my behavior in ways that I resented, but felt were necessary for my safety and peace of mind. I filed complaints with Walmart Corporate, the Better Business Bureau, and the Arizona Attorney General's office. I also contacted local civil rights organizations to report the discriminatory treatment and seek advice about potential legal remedies. The corporate response was predictably inadequate. A form letter acknowledging my complaint and promising to look into the matter, followed by no meaningful follow-up or accountability. Several weeks later, I learned from a friend who worked at that store that multiple customers had filed similar complaints about the same loss prevention officer, and that there was a pattern of him targeting young people of color for intensive surveillance and harassment. Despite this documented pattern of discriminatory behavior, the employee remained in his position, suggesting that the store's management either didn't take these complaints seriously or didn't consider racial profiling to be a significant problem. This experience taught me that discrimination in retail settings is not just about individual prejudice, but about systemic failures to train employees properly, establish clear protocols for customer interactions, and hold staff accountable when they engage in biased behavior. The fact that multiple employees participated in my harassment without question suggests that this type of treatment is normalized within the store's culture, rather than being an isolated incident involving one problematic employee. I now shop at different stores whenever possible, and when I do have to visit Walmart locations, I'm constantly on guard for signs that I'm being profiled or targeted for special attention. The carefree attitude I once had about running errands has been replaced by vigilance and anxiety that I shouldn't have to experience as a paying customer in a public business. My name is Luis, and I'm a 32-year-old high school mathematics teacher living in Scottsdale, Arizona. I've always prided myself on being a patient, rational person who tries to handle conflicts diplomatically, which I suppose comes from spending my days managing classrooms full of teenagers. But what happened to me at the Walmart on Frank Lloyd Wright Boulevard 9 months ago was so egregious and deliberately humiliating that it fundamentally changed how I view corporate policies and the potential for abuse when employees are given unchecked authority over customers. This incident took place on a Friday evening around 6:30 p.m. I had just finished a long week of teaching and grading final exams, and I was looking forward to a relaxing weekend. I needed to pick up some groceries and a few items for a barbecue I was hosting for my fellow teachers the next day. The store was busy with the typical Friday evening crowd. People stopping by after work, families doing their weekly shopping, and others preparing for weekend activities. I was moving through the store efficiently, having made a list organized by section to minimize my time spent shopping. I had picked up most of what I needed and was in the pharmacy area looking for some over-the-counter allergy medication when I encountered a teenage girl, probably around 16 years old, who was clearly in distress. She was crying quietly and kept looking around nervously, clutching a small package of makeup items that she appeared to be trying to hide under her jacket. As a teacher, I'm trained to recognize when young people are in trouble, and my instinct was to see if she needed help or if there was an adult I could contact on her behalf. Before I could approach her, however, a loss prevention officer appeared and confronted her about the concealed merchandise. She immediately broke down, admitting that she had taken the items and apologizing profusely. She explained that she was trying to buy makeup for her school's homecoming dance, but didn't have enough money, and she had made a stupid, impulsive decision to try to steal what she couldn't afford. The loss prevention officer was a middle-aged man who seemed to take particular pleasure in having caught someone in the act of shoplifting. Instead of handling the situation with the discretion and professionalism you would expect when dealing with a minor who had clearly learned her lesson and was genuinely remorseful, he decided to turn the incident into a public spectacle that I can only describe as psychological torture. He made the girl stand at the customer service desk at the front of the store, holding the stolen makeup items above her head like some kind of trophy, while he loudly announced to every customer within earshot that she was a thief. He wasn't just informing people about the situation. He was deliberately drawing attention to her, making sure that as many people as possible would witness her humiliation. He seemed to believe that public shaming was an appropriate form of punishment. And he was clearly enjoying the power he had over this frightened teenager. For nearly 20 minutes, he kept her standing there while he lectured her about the consequences of stealing and made announcements over the store's intercom system about shoplifting prevention. He was treating her like an object lesson rather than a human being, using her mistake as an opportunity to demonstrate his authority and send a message to other potential shoplifters. The girl was sobbing uncontrollably, clearly traumatized by the public nature of her punishment. But he showed no compassion or concern for her emotional state. Other customers began to complain about the spectacle. Several people approached the customer service desk to express their discomfort with how the situation was being handled, pointing out that the girl was obviously sorry for what she had done, and that the public humiliation was excessive and inappropriate. Parents with children were particularly upset, explaining that they didn't want their kids to witness such a degrading display, regardless of what the teenager had done wrong. The loss prevention officer became defensive and argumentative when challenged about his methods. He claimed that he was preventing future crime, and that public shaming works better than anything else when dealing with young shoplifters. He insisted that the girl needed to learn consequences, and that being embarrassed in front of strangers was exactly what she deserved for breaking the law. His attitude suggested that he viewed compassion or discretion as weakness, and that maximum humiliation was the most effective deterrent. When I approached the customer service desk to express my concern about how the situation was being handled, the loss prevention officer immediately became hostile toward me. He demanded to know why I was interfering in store business and suggested that anyone who defended shoplifters was probably a thief themselves. He accused me of trying to distract him so that other people could steal merchandise while his attention was diverted, which was obviously a ridiculous and unfounded accusation. I identified myself as a teacher and explained that I had professional experience working with teenagers who had made poor decisions, and that there were more effective and humane ways to handle these situations. I pointed out that the public humiliation could cause lasting psychological damage, and that the girl had already learned her lesson without needing to be further traumatized. I suggested that they contact her parents and handle the matter privately, as would be appropriate when dealing with a minor. The loss prevention officer's response was to escalate the confrontation and attempt to make me part of the spectacle. He started speaking loudly about how some people thought they knew better than security professionals, and how bleeding heart liberals were the reason crime was increasing. He was clearly trying to turn other customers against me by framing my concern for the teenagers' welfare as enabling criminal behavior. When the girl's mother finally arrived, she was horrified by what she found. Her daughter was still standing at the front of the store, holding the stolen items, surrounded by gawking customers, and clearly in a state of emotional collapse. The mother immediately demanded to know why her daughter was being subjected to public humiliation instead of being handled through proper legal channels. She pointed out that the treatment her daughter was receiving was potentially illegal, and that she was considering contacting both the police and an attorney. The loss prevention officer's attitude changed immediately when faced with the possibility of legal consequences. He suddenly became much more professional and started talking about standard procedures and company policy, as if the public shaming had been required rather than his personal choice. He tried to frame the situation as a learning experience that would benefit the teenager in the long run. But it was obvious that he was backtracking because he realized he might have crossed legal boundaries. The mother refused to accept these explanations and demanded to speak with the store manager immediately. When the manager arrived, she was clearly uncomfortable with what had transpired, but seemed more concerned about protecting the store from liability than addressing the inappropriate behavior of her employee. She offered vague apologies and promised to review the situation, but she didn't take any immediate action to discipline the loss prevention officer or acknowledge that his behavior had been unacceptable. The teenager was ultimately released to her mother's custody with a warning, and no formal charges were filed. However, the psychological damage had already been done. The girl was clearly traumatized by the experience, and her mother was rightfully angry about how the situation had been mishandled. Several customers, including myself, provided our contact information as witnesses in case the family decided to pursue legal action against the store. I filed a detailed complaint with Walmart Corporate the following Monday, describing the loss prevention officer's behavior and explaining why his methods were inappropriate and potentially harmful. I emphasized my professional background working with teenagers and provided specific recommendations for how similar situations should be handled in the future. I also pointed out that the public spectacle had created a hostile environment for other customers and that several people had expressed discomfort with witnessing the girl's humiliation. The corporate response was disappointing and inadequate. I received a form letter acknowledging my complaint and promising that the matter would be investigated. But there was no follow-up communication and no indication that any disciplinary action had been taken. When I called the store directly several weeks later to inquire about the status of my complaint, I was told that personnel matters were confidential and that they couldn't provide any information about whether the loss prevention officer was still employed or had received additional training. Several months later, I encountered the same loss prevention officer at the same store, and he was still employed in the same position. When he saw me, he made a point of following me through the store and watching my activities closely, clearly attempting to intimidate me and discourage me from shopping there. His behavior suggested that not only had he faced no consequences for his previous inappropriate conduct, but that he felt justified in retaliating against customers who had complained about his methods. This experience taught me several disturbing lessons about corporate accountability and the potential for abuse when employees are given authority over customers without proper oversight or training. The loss prevention officer's behavior wasn't just unprofessional. It was cruel and potentially damaging to a young person who had made a mistake and was already facing appropriate consequences. The fact that store management failed to address the situation meaningfully suggested that such behavior was either explicitly approved or implicitly tolerated as part of the store's culture. The incident also highlighted the powerlessness that customers can feel when confronted with employee misconduct in retail settings. Despite filing detailed complaints and providing professional recommendations for improvement, I had no effective recourse. When the store chose to ignore my concerns and take no corrective action, the loss prevention officer continued to work in a position where he could potentially harm other customers, and there seemed to be no mechanism for holding him accountable for his behavior. As an educator, I was particularly troubled by the missed opportunity to handle the situation in a way that could have been genuinely educational for the teenager involved. Instead of learning about accountability, consequences, and the importance of making better choices, she learned about humiliation, abuse of authority, and the cruelty that can hide behind official policies. The experience likely caused more psychological harm than any constructive learning, and it represented a failure of the systems that should protect young people who make mistakes. My name is Alina, and I'm a 33-year-old certified public accountant working for a small firm in Tempe, Arizona. I've always considered myself someone who stays calm under pressure. It's part of my job to handle stressful situations and think logically when others might panic. But what happened during a massive power outage at the Walmart on Baseline Road 7 months ago showed me just how quickly civilization can break down when people are scared, trapped, and anonymous in the darkness. The experience left me with a profound understanding of how fragile the social order really is, and how easily ordinary people can become dangerous when they think no one is watching. This incident occurred on a Thursday evening around 8:30 p.m. during the summer, when Arizona was experiencing record-breaking heat and strain on the electrical grid. I had stopped at Walmart after working late to pick up some groceries and a few household items before heading home. The store was moderately busy with evening shoppers, and I was taking my time browsing since I wasn't in any particular hurry. I remember thinking how nice it was to be in the air conditioning after spending the day in my stuffy office, and I was actually enjoying the mundane task of grocery shopping as a way to decompress from a challenging workday. I was in the middle of the store, somewhere between the pharmacy and the clothing sections, when every single light went out simultaneously. The transition from bright fluorescent lighting to complete darkness was so sudden and total that it took several seconds for my eyes to even begin adjusting. The immediate silence was eerie. All the background humming of refrigeration units, air conditioning, and electronic equipment stopped at once, creating a stillness that felt unnatural in such a large commercial space. The darkness wasn't gradual or partial. It was absolute, for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, let alone navigate through aisles filled with merchandise and other disoriented customers. I could hear people bumping into displays, knocking items over, and calling out to family members they had been separated from in the blackout. The initial reaction was mostly confusion and mild concern, with people making jokes about the timing and assuming the power would be restored within a few minutes. When the emergency lighting finally activated, it provided just enough illumination to reveal the scope of the situation without actually making navigation safe or comfortable. The emergency lights only covered the main aisles and exit routes, leaving large sections of the store in near total darkness. The lighting created stark contrasts between brightly lit areas and deep shadows, making it difficult to judge distances or identify obstacles. More importantly, it became immediately apparent that there were far more people in the store than I had realized, and many of them were already showing signs of anxiety and claustrophobia. The first announcement came about 5 minutes after the power failure, informing customers that the outage was affecting a large area and that the store's doors had automatically locked as a security measure. The announcement explained that they were working to restore power and that customers would be released as soon as it was safe to do so. But they couldn't provide a timeline for when that might happen. The words "automatically locked" caused an immediate shift in the crowd's mood from mild inconvenience to genuine concern about being trapped. What followed was a gradual but unmistakable deterioration of social order, as people realized they might be confined in the store for an extended period. The initial politeness and cooperation that had characterized the first few minutes after the blackout began to give way to more selfish and aggressive behavior, as individuals started prioritizing their own comfort and safety over the collective good. I watched as the situation evolved from a shared inconvenience to something that felt increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. The first sign of trouble came from a group of teenagers who seemed to view the power outage as an opportunity rather than a crisis. They were using their cell phone flashlights to navigate into the darker sections of the store, and I could hear them laughing and talking about free shopping and getting what they deserved for being trapped. It became clear that they were taking advantage of the limited visibility and reduced security presence to steal merchandise, assuming that the chaos would prevent them from being caught or held accountable. Their behavior emboldened others who might not have normally considered theft, but saw an opportunity in the confusion and darkness. I witnessed people stuffing items into bags, pockets, and shopping carts, taking things they clearly hadn't paid for and couldn't afford to purchase legally. Some were grabbing necessities like water and snacks, which might have been understandable given the circumstances. But others were taking electronics, clothing, and other non-essential items that were obviously motivated by greed rather than survival needs. The situation became more frightening when the crowd dynamics started to shift toward panic and aggression. An elderly woman fell in one of the darker areas, apparently unable to see a display that had been knocked over. And instead of helping her, several people simply stepped around her or pushed past her to get to where they were trying to go. When her husband tried to help her up and asked for assistance, he was largely ignored by people who were focused on their own situations and increasingly unwilling to help strangers. The air conditioning had stopped working when the power went out, and the temperature inside the store began rising quickly in the desert heat. What had initially been a comfortable shopping environment became stuffy and uncomfortable, adding physical stress to the psychological pressure of being trapped. People were becoming irritable and short-tempered, and I could sense that the crowd was becoming less predictable and more potentially volatile as time passed without resolution. Children were crying, which added to the stress and chaos, and parents were struggling to keep their families together in the limited visibility. Some people were having panic attacks or claustrophobic reactions to being confined, and their distress was spreading to others around them. The sound of crying, arguing, and general distress was creating a feedback loop of anxiety that was making everyone more agitated and less rational in their decision-making. About an hour into the outage, there was a surge toward the exit doors when someone spread a rumor that they had been unlocked. The rush created a dangerous crush of bodies as people pushed and shoved to try to reach what they thought might be freedom. Several people were knocked down in the stampede, and I heard what sounded like someone screaming in pain, though I couldn't see clearly enough to know exactly what had happened or how severe any injuries might have been. The exit doors were still locked, which led to increased frustration and more aggressive behavior from people who felt deceived and trapped. Some individuals started pounding on the doors and windows, trying to break them open or attract attention from outside. Others were demanding that store employees unlock the doors manually, becoming hostile when told that the employees didn't have the ability to override the automatic security system during a power failure. I positioned myself near what seemed to be a relatively safe area close to the pharmacy, trying to stay out of the main flow of foot traffic while keeping an eye on the various situations developing throughout the store. From that vantage point, I could observe how different groups were reacting to the crisis and how quickly social norms were breaking down under stress. The contrast between people's public personas and their behavior in what they perceived as an anonymous, consequence-free environment was startling and disturbing. Some customers were organizing themselves constructively, sharing cell phone lights to help others navigate safely and trying to maintain order in their immediate areas. But these positive efforts were being undermined by others who were taking advantage of the chaos to engage in behavior they would never consider under normal circumstances. The store had essentially become a microcosm of society under extreme stress, revealing both the best and worst aspects of human nature in a compressed time frame. The most frightening aspect of the experience was realizing how quickly the situation could have escalated to serious violence if the power outage had lasted longer or if the crowd had become more panicked. I could see the potential for stampedes, fights over resources, and other dangerous scenarios developing as people became more desperate and less willing to follow normal social conventions. The thin line between civilization and chaos was becoming increasingly apparent as the evening progressed. When the power was finally restored after nearly 2 hours, the sudden return of bright lighting revealed the full extent of what had transpired during the blackout. Merchandise was scattered throughout the store, displays had been knocked over, and there was clear evidence of widespread theft and property damage. The cleanup process was extensive, and I later learned that the store had to close for 3 days to assess inventory losses, repair damaged fixtures, and review security footage to identify people who had stolen merchandise during the outage. Several customers required medical attention for injuries sustained during the crowd's surges and falls in the darkness. The psychological impact on many people, particularly children and elderly customers, was significant and lasting. What should have been a minor inconvenience had turned into a traumatic experience that revealed the vulnerability of everyone involved and the inadequacy of emergency procedures designed to handle such situations. The experience changed my perspective on emergency preparedness, crowd dynamics, and the reliability of the systems we depend on for safety and order in public spaces. I realized that being trapped with a crowd of strangers during a crisis could be more dangerous than the original emergency itself, and that individual behavior under stress could create risks that were far more immediate and threatening than external threats. I now avoid shopping during peak hours when possible, and I'm much more aware of exit locations and emergency procedures whenever I'm in large public spaces. The power outage at Walmart taught me that ordinary people can become unpredictable and dangerous when they feel trapped and anonymous, and that the social contracts we rely on for civility and cooperation are far more fragile than most of us realize. My name is Jasper, and I'm a 41-year-old police officer with the Houston Police Department, working in community patrol for the past 12 years. In my line of work, I've seen more disturbing crime scenes and human suffering than most people encounter in a lifetime. So I don't shock easily or jump to dramatic conclusions about situations that might seem suspicious to civilians. But what I discovered at the Walmart on Veterans Memorial Drive 10 months ago was so deeply troubling that it still affects how I think about personal safety in public spaces and the responsibility we all have to look out for one another. This wasn't just about finding evidence of a crime. It was about realizing how many people had failed to act when someone was in desperate need of help. This incident occurred on a Tuesday evening around 9:45 p.m. I was off duty, still wearing civilian clothes, and had stopped at the 24-hour Walmart to pick up some supplies I needed for a home repair project I was working on during my days off. I prefer shopping late at night when possible because the stores are less crowded. And after spending my shifts dealing with the public in official capacity, I appreciate being able to run errands without the potential for work-related interruptions or recognition. I had been in the store for about 20 minutes, gathering the items I needed from the hardware and automotive sections, when I realized I needed to use the restroom before making the drive home. I headed toward the back of the store where the public facilities are located, past the pharmacy and vision center toward the employee areas where the customer restrooms are typically situated in most Walmart layouts. As I approached the men's restroom, I immediately noticed something was wrong. There was a distinct smell that didn't belong in a retail environment. Metallic and organic, unmistakable to someone with my professional background. It was the smell of blood, and it was strong enough to be noticeable from several feet away from the restroom entrance. My training kicked in immediately, and I became alert to the possibility that I was approaching a crime scene or medical emergency. The restroom door was propped open with a wet floor sign, which struck me as unusual since most stores don't typically leave restroom doors open during operating hours. As I got closer, I could see that there were dark stains on the floor leading from the entrance toward the back of the restroom, and the smell was becoming stronger and more unmistakable. My professional instincts told me to proceed carefully and be prepared for whatever I might find inside. When I entered the restroom, I could see that one of the stall doors was closed, and there was a significant amount of blood pooled on the floor around the base of the stall. The blood wasn't fresh. It had the darker, congealed appearance that indicates it had been there for several hours. But the quantity was alarming, suggesting serious injury or trauma rather than a minor accident like a nosebleed or small cut. I called out to see if anyone was in the stall and needed assistance, but there was no response. The silence was ominous, and I was increasingly concerned that I might be about to discover a deceased person or someone who was unconscious and in critical condition. I pushed open the stall door, expecting to find a victim, but instead discovered something that was almost more disturbing: evidence of violence with no victim present. The inside of the stall was covered in blood spatter patterns that my training allowed me to interpret as signs of a serious assault. The walls had blood at various heights, suggesting either multiple impacts or that someone had been beaten while trying to defend themselves or escape. There were also what appeared to be defensive wounds patterns and signs of a struggle, including damaged fixtures and torn clothing fibers caught on rough edges. Most troubling was the quantity of blood and the fact that whoever had been injured was no longer present. The blood loss suggested injuries that would require immediate medical attention, but there was no indication that emergency services had been called or that the victim had received help. The scene suggested that someone had either left on their own, despite serious injuries, or had been moved by others after the assault occurred. I immediately called 911 from my cell phone to report the discovery and request that patrol units and medical personnel respond to the scene. While I was waiting for the first responders to arrive, I spoke with store employees to try to understand how long the restroom had been in this condition and whether anyone had reported finding anything unusual or concerning. The responses I received from store personnel were deeply disturbing and suggested a pattern of negligence that had potentially put someone's life at risk. Multiple employees acknowledged that customers had complained about a bad smell in that restroom throughout the day. But rather than investigating the source of the odor, they had simply placed out-of-order signs on some of the other stalls and assumed it was a plumbing issue. One cashier told me that at least 3 customers had mentioned the smell to her during her shift, and one had specifically said it smelled like something had died in the restroom. Another employee admitted that he had noticed the odor when he walked past the area earlier in the day, but had assumed maintenance would handle whatever the problem was. No one had actually entered the restroom to investigate or determine whether there might be a medical emergency or safety hazard. When the responding officers and paramedics arrived, they confirmed my assessment that the scene showed evidence of a serious assault that had occurred several hours earlier. The blood spatter analysis suggested that someone had sustained injuries that would have been life-threatening without immediate medical attention. The fact that no victim was found at the scene raised questions about whether the injured person had managed to seek help elsewhere, or whether something even more sinister had occurred. The investigation eventually revealed that the victim was a female store employee who had been attacked during her break by someone she knew, a domestic violence situation that had followed her to her workplace. The attack had occurred in the early afternoon, approximately 6 hours before I discovered the scene. She had managed to escape and drive herself to a hospital, where she received treatment for serious but non-life-threatening injuries. What made this situation particularly disturbing was learning that she had been unconscious in that stall for nearly an hour after the assault, during which time multiple customers had complained about the smell and unusual sounds coming from the restroom area. If even one person had investigated further or insisted that an employee check the restroom thoroughly, she could have received medical attention much sooner and might not have suffered as extensively as she did. The store's response to the situation was inadequate and concerning. Rather than acknowledging the failure of their employees to respond appropriately to multiple customer complaints about a potential emergency, management seemed more focused on limiting liability and avoiding negative publicity. They claimed that their employees had followed proper procedures, even though it was clear that no one had actually investigated the source of the odor that customers were reporting. The security camera footage revealed another disturbing aspect of the situation. Several employees had walked past the restroom area during the time the victim was unconscious inside, and at least 2 had paused outside the door as if they had noticed something unusual. However, neither had taken any action to investigate or ensure that the restroom was safe for customers to use. The incident highlighted significant gaps in employee training regarding emergency response and customer safety. Store personnel had no clear protocols for responding to unusual odors, sounds, or customer complaints that might indicate medical emergencies or safety hazards. They were more concerned about avoiding potential liability from entering restrooms than they were about ensuring that people weren't suffering or dying in areas under their supervision. As a police officer, I was particularly troubled by the missed opportunities to provide timely assistance to someone who was seriously injured and vulnerable. The victim had lost consciousness due to her injuries and was completely dependent on others to discover her situation and summon help. The fact that multiple people noticed signs that something was wrong but failed to take action demonstrated a troubling lack of civic responsibility and basic human compassion. The assault suspect was eventually arrested and charged with domestic violence and assault. But the case was complicated by the delay in discovering the crime scene and the victim's extended period without medical attention. The injuries she sustained were more severe than they would have been if she had received prompt treatment, and the psychological trauma was compounded by the knowledge that she had been abandoned and ignored while she was unconscious and bleeding. I filed a detailed report about the incident and made recommendations for improved employee training and emergency response procedures. I also suggested that stores should have clear protocols for investigating unusual odors or customer complaints that might indicate safety hazards, rather than assuming that maintenance issues are always minor and non-urgent. The experience changed how I think about bystander responsibility and the importance of trusting instincts when something seems wrong. As citizens, we all have an obligation to speak up when we notice signs that someone might need help, and we shouldn't assume that someone else will handle concerning situations if we don't take action ourselves. This case also reinforced my understanding of how domestic violence can follow victims into what should be safe spaces like their workplaces, and how important it is for employers to have security measures and support systems in place to protect employees who might be targeted by abusive partners or family members. The victim eventually recovered from her physical injuries, but the psychological impact of knowing that her cries for help went unheeded while she was unconscious and bleeding in a public restroom continues to affect her sense of safety and trust in others. Her experience serves as a reminder that our failure to act when we suspect someone might be in trouble can have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate situation. My name is Skylar, and I'm a 26-year-old graphic designer working freelance in Glendale, Arizona. I tend to keep irregular hours because of my work schedule, often staying up late to meet client deadlines and then running errands at odd times when most people are either at work or asleep. I've always enjoyed the quiet, unhurried atmosphere of late-night shopping, where you can take your time browsing without dealing with crowds or long checkout lines. But what happened to me at the Walmart on 67th Avenue 8 months ago turned what should have been a routine shopping trip into a genuinely frightening experience that made me realize just how vulnerable you can become when normal business operations break down and safety systems fail. This incident occurred on a Sunday evening, and I had been working on a particularly complex design project for most of the weekend. I had lost track of time, as I often do when I'm deeply focused on creative work, and suddenly realized it was nearly 10 p.m. and I hadn't eaten anything substantial all day. I also needed to pick up some art supplies and household items that I had been putting off buying for several days. The Walmart on 67th Avenue was one of the few places still open that would have everything I needed, and I figured I could get in and out quickly before they closed at 11 p.m. When I arrived at the store around 10:15 p.m., the parking lot was nearly empty except for employee vehicles and a few other late shoppers who were probably in similar situations to mine. The store felt spacious and peaceful in a way that daytime shopping never allows, and I was actually enjoying the opportunity to browse leisurely through sections I normally would have rushed through. I took my time looking at art supplies, comparing prices on items I didn't urgently need, and generally treating the shopping trip as a relaxing break from my intensive work weekend. I was so absorbed in what I was doing that I completely lost track of time. I vaguely heard the closing announcements over the intercom system, but I assumed I still had plenty of time to finish my shopping and check out before the store closed. I had done late-night shopping many times before, and was familiar with the routine of stores giving customers advance warning before closing time. I figured I had at least 15 or 20 minutes to complete my purchases and make it to the checkout area. It wasn't until I heard the lights dimming in some sections of the store that I realized closing time was imminent. I quickly gathered the remaining items on my list and headed toward the front of the store to check out. There were still a few other customers in the checkout area, and I assumed I had made it within the acceptable time frame for completing purchases before the store officially closed for the night. The checkout process took longer than expected because there was only one register open, and the few remaining customers ahead of me had large orders or complicated transactions. By the time I finished paying for my items, the store felt noticeably different. Most of the overhead lighting had been dimmed or turned off completely, and I could see employees in the distance beginning their closing procedures. The atmosphere had shifted from the comfortable, relaxed feeling of late-night shopping to something that felt more urgent and slightly unsettling. When I walked toward what I assumed was the main exit, I discovered that the automatic doors were not functioning. I stood in front of them for several seconds, waving my hands to trigger the sensors and shifting my weight from side to side to try to activate the motion detectors. But nothing happened. The doors remained firmly closed, and there was no indication of any mechanical operation or response to my presence. I looked around for store employees or other customers who might be able to help me understand what was happening. But the front area of the store appeared to be completely empty. The customer service desk was unmanned, and I couldn't see any employees in the immediate vicinity who could explain why the doors weren't working or direct me to an alternate exit. The silence and emptiness felt increasingly eerie as I realized I might be alone in a closed retail space. I tried walking to different entrances around the store perimeter, testing each set of automatic doors to see if any of them were still functioning or if there was a manual override that would allow me to exit. Every door I tried was completely unresponsive, sealed shut as if they were part of a security lockdown system designed to prevent unauthorized entry or exit during non-business hours. The realization that I was effectively trapped inside the building began to create a sense of panic that I had never experienced before. My cell phone showed that it was now past 11:30 p.m., well after the store's official closing time, and I was beginning to understand that I had somehow been overlooked during the closing procedures and was now locked inside for the night. The implications of this situation were becoming increasingly frightening as I considered how long I might be trapped and whether anyone would realize I was missing until the store reopened the next morning. I began walking through the store calling out for employees, hoping to find someone who could help me exit the building, or at least explain what had happened and what options were available for resolving the situation. The dimmed lighting and empty aisles created an atmosphere that felt surreal and vaguely threatening, like being trapped in a post-apocalyptic movie set where civilization had suddenly disappeared. After about 15 minutes of searching, I finally found a janitor working in the back of the store near the employee areas. He seemed genuinely surprised to see me and immediately asked how I had gotten past the security systems and why I was still in the building after closing time. When I explained that I had been shopping when the store closed and couldn't find a way to exit, he looked confused and somewhat concerned about the situation. The janitor explained that there were supposed to be security sweeps conducted before the building was locked down for the night, specifically to ensure that no customers were inadvertently trapped inside. The fact that I had been missed during these procedures suggested either a failure of protocol or negligence on the part of whoever was responsible for conducting the final security check. He seemed unsure about the proper procedure for handling the situation and had to radio for assistance from a supervisor. While we waited for the supervisor to respond, the janitor shared some information that made me realize how potentially dangerous my situation could have been. He explained that the store's security system was designed to prevent break-ins, but it also made it extremely difficult for anyone to exit the building once the lockdown procedures were activated. The emergency exits were equipped with alarms that would summon police and security services. But activating them would also trigger investigations and potentially result in criminal charges for anyone who couldn't prove they had legitimate reasons for being in the building. He also mentioned that there had been incidents in the past where people had been accidentally locked inside overnight, and that some of those situations had resulted in medical emergencies when people with health conditions were unable to access their medications or when individuals became severely claustrophobic or panicked in the confined environment. The idea that I could have been trapped until morning, with no way to communicate my situation to anyone outside the building, was terrifying to contemplate. When the supervisor finally arrived, nearly 30 minutes after the janitor had called for help, she seemed more concerned about potential liability issues than about my welfare or safety. She asked detailed questions about how I had managed to remain in the store past closing time, as if I had deliberately tried to hide or evade the security procedures. Her tone suggested that she suspected I might have been attempting to shoplift or engage in some other unauthorized activity rather than simply being an innocent customer who had lost track of time. The supervisor eventually agreed to let me exit through an employee entrance. but only after checking my receipt, examining the items I had purchased, and taking down my personal information for what she claimed were security records. The entire process felt like I was being treated as a potential criminal rather than a customer who had been failed by the store's safety procedures. As the supervisor walked me to the employee exit, she mentioned that I was lucky the janitor had found me when he did, because the building would be completely empty overnight, except for automated security systems. She explained that if I had triggered any of the motion sensors or alarms during the night, it would have resulted in police response and potentially serious legal complications, even though I had done nothing wrong. The experience of being escorted through the dark, empty store to a back exit made me feel like I was being smuggled out of a place where I shouldn't have been, rather than simply leaving a business where I had been a legitimate customer. The supervisor's attitude throughout the process suggested that the store viewed the incident as my fault, rather than acknowledging that their security procedures had failed to protect a customer's safety and well-being. When I finally got outside, it was nearly midnight, and the parking lot was completely empty except for my car sitting alone under a single security light. The contrast between the bustling, well-lit environment I had entered a few hours earlier and the dark, abandoned scene I was leaving was stark and unsettling. I realized that if the janitor hadn't found me, I could have been trapped in that building for 8 or 9 hours with no way to contact anyone or explain my situation. I filed a complaint with Walmart Corporate the following day, describing the failure of their security procedures and the potential danger I had been placed in due to their negligence. The response I received was a form letter acknowledging my complaint, but providing no information about what steps would be taken to prevent similar incidents in the future. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the safety risk I had been exposed to, and no indication that the store would review or improve their closing procedures. The psychological impact of being trapped in that store was more significant than I initially realized. For weeks afterward, I felt anxious about shopping alone, particularly during evening hours when there were fewer people around. I became hyper-aware of store closing times and made sure to finish shopping well before any business was scheduled to close, even during normal daytime hours. My name is George, and I'm a 55-year-old mechanic who's been working on cars in San Antonio, Texas for over 30 years. I'm not someone who scares easily or jumps to dramatic conclusions, but what happened to me and my father at the Walmart on Military Drive 11 months ago still keeps me awake at night. It's not just the fear of what could have happened. It's the terrible realization of how easily someone can vanish in plain sight and how little protection we really have when predators decide to target the most vulnerable among us. My father, Robert, is 78 years old and was diagnosed with early-stage dementia about 2 years ago. Most days he's pretty lucid and can handle routine activities with minimal supervision. But he gets confused in unfamiliar environments and sometimes loses track of time or forgets where he is. I've been taking him shopping with me on weekends, partly to give my mother a break and partly because he enjoys getting out of the house and feeling useful. We've developed a routine where I handle the main shopping while he helps by pushing the cart or picking out items from my list. This particular incident happened on a Saturday afternoon around 2 p.m. We were doing our weekly grocery run, picking up supplies for a family barbecue we were hosting the next day. Dad was having a pretty good day. He was alert, conversational, and seemed to be enjoying himself as we moved through the store collecting items on our list. I felt comfortable letting him wander a few feet away to look at things that caught his interest as long as he stayed within my sight and didn't venture too far from our cart. We were in the produce section when I realized I had forgotten to grab my shopping list from the car. It was a detailed list that my wife had prepared, and I knew I'd forget half the items we needed if I tried to shop from memory. I told Dad to stay right there by the banana display, and that I'd be back in just a couple of minutes. He nodded and said he understood, and I could see him examining the bananas and organizing them by ripeness, which is something he likes to do. A small task that makes him feel helpful and engaged. The trip to my truck should have taken no more than 3 minutes. I parked relatively close to the entrance. I walked quickly, and I grabbed the list from the dashboard where I'd left it. But when I returned to the produce section, Dad was gone. At first, I wasn't overly concerned because he sometimes gets distracted by interesting displays or decides to explore nearby aisles. I checked the areas immediately around where I had left him, assuming he had wandered toward the bakery or deli sections that usually attract his attention. After 5 minutes of searching the adjacent areas, I started to feel the first stirrings of real anxiety. Dad's dementia makes him prone to confusion in large spaces, and if he had gotten disoriented, he might not remember where we had been shopping or how to find me. I began expanding my search systematically, checking every aisle in the grocery section, and then moving into the general merchandise areas of the store. I asked several Walmart employees if they had seen an elderly man matching Dad's description, and while they were sympathetic and offered to help, none of them remembered seeing him. The store was busy with weekend shoppers, and I realized that one confused elderly man could easily blend into the crowd or be overlooked by staff members who were focused on their own tasks and customers. After 15 minutes of searching, I asked customer service to make an announcement over the intercom system. They paged Robert and asked him to come to the customer service desk, providing a description of what he was wearing and asking any customers who had seen him to report his location. The announcement was repeated several times, but there was no response from Dad and no information from other shoppers. That's when a female customer approached me with information that made my blood run cold. She said she had been in the parking lot about 10 minutes earlier and had seen an elderly man who matched my father's description being helped into a van by 2 people. At the time, she had assumed it was a family situation, adult children helping their father get into their vehicle. But when she heard the store announcement and my description of Dad, she realized it might have been the same person. The woman described the van as dark blue or black, older model, with 2 people who appeared to be a middle-aged man and woman. She said the elderly man seemed confused and was asking questions, but the people with him were reassuring him and telling him they were taking him somewhere safe. At the time, it had looked like a normal family interaction, but in retrospect, she was worried that she might have witnessed something more sinister. I immediately called 911 and reported my father as a missing person, providing details about his dementia diagnosis and the potential abduction that the witness had described. The police response was swift and professional, with officers arriving within minutes to take statements and begin coordinating a search. They interviewed the witness who had seen Dad being taken to the van, and they also requested access to the store's security camera footage to try to identify the vehicle and the people involved. The next 6 hours were the longest of my life. My family was notified, and we organized search teams to check areas around San Antonio where Dad might have been taken or might have wandered if he had somehow gotten away from his captors. The police issued an Amber Alert-style notification for vulnerable adults, and local news stations broadcast Dad's description and information about the suspicious van. The security camera review was partially helpful, but also frustratingly incomplete. The cameras showed Dad walking alone in the produce section after I left to get my list. But then there was a gap in coverage where he seemed to disappear from view. The parking lot cameras captured what appeared to be the incident the witness had described. But the image quality wasn't sufficient to clearly identify the license plate or the faces of the people involved. What the cameras did show was disturbing enough. Dad appeared confused and was clearly asking questions as he was being guided toward the van. The two people with him were being patient and reassuring. But they were also persistent in getting him to come with them despite his obvious uncertainty about the situation. It looked exactly like what predators would do if they were specifically targeting confused elderly people who might be easily manipulated or convinced to cooperate. The police investigation revealed that this wasn't an isolated incident. There had been several reports in the San Antonio area of elderly people with dementia going missing from public places under suspicious circumstances. In most cases, the missing persons were found within 24 to 48 hours, usually in locations far from where they had disappeared, with no clear explanation of how they had gotten there or who had transported them. Dad was finally found at a truck stop about 40 miles outside San Antonio at around 8 p.m. He was confused, scared, and couldn't provide a coherent account of what had happened to him or how he had gotten there. The people who had him claimed they were Good Samaritans who had found him wandering in a parking lot and were trying to help him. But their story didn't make sense given the witness account and the security footage. The couple insisted they had been trying to help Dad find his family and had been driving around looking for a police station when someone at the truck stop recognized him from the news broadcasts. They claimed they had tried to get information from Dad about his family, but his confusion had made it impossible to determine where he lived or who to contact. Their explanation sounded plausible on the surface, but there were inconsistencies that made me deeply suspicious of their true motives. The most disturbing aspect of their story was the timeline. The truck stop where Dad was found was at least an hour's drive from the Walmart where he had disappeared, but he had been missing for more than 6 hours. If they had really been trying to help him find his family or return him to safety, why hadn't they taken him to a police station, hospital, or fire station during those intervening hours? Why drive him so far from where they had allegedly found him? The police investigation was hampered by Dad's inability to remember clearly what had happened, and by the lack of conclusive evidence that the couple had intended to harm him. They were questioned extensively, but without proof of criminal intent or evidence that Dad had been harmed, it was difficult to bring charges against them. The legal system seemed inadequately equipped to handle situations where vulnerable adults might be targeted by people who understand exactly how to exploit their confusion and helplessness. What haunts me most about this experience is the realization that predators are actively looking for people like my father, individuals with cognitive impairments who can be easily manipulated and who might not be able to provide accurate accounts of what happens to them. The couple who had Dad knew exactly how to present themselves as helpful strangers, and if that witness hadn't seen them taking him to their van, we might never have known what had really happened. The incident has fundamentally changed how I think about my father's safety and independence. I no longer feel comfortable taking him to public places where he might be separated from me. Saku, even briefly. The casual attitude I once had about letting him wander a few feet away while shopping has been replaced by constant vigilance and anxiety about potential threats from people who specifically target vulnerable, elderly individuals. I've also become much more aware of how easily someone can disappear in a crowded public space, and how little protection our systems provide for people who can't protect themselves. The fact that Dad could vanish from a busy store in broad daylight with security cameras and multiple employees present demonstrated just how vulnerable people with dementia really are when they're outside their familiar environments. The psychological impact on Dad has been significant as well. Even though he can't remember all the details of what happened, he retained enough of the experience to become fearful about going out in public. He's more clingy and anxious when we do go shopping together. And he's lost some of the independence and confidence that had made these outings enjoyable for both of us. This experience taught me that the people we love most can become targets simply because of their vulnerabilities, and that there are individuals out there who will exploit confusion and helplessness for purposes we may never fully understand. The terror of those 6 hours when Dad was missing will stay with me forever. And it's changed how I view the safety of public spaces and the responsibility we all have to protect the most vulnerable members of our community. My name is Valerie, and I'm a 42-year-old registered nurse working at Phoenix Children's Hospital. After 15 years in healthcare, I consider myself pretty tech-savvy and security-conscious, especially when it comes to protecting personal information and understanding how digital systems can be exploited. But what I discovered at the Walmart on 35th Avenue 9 months ago exposed a level of digital surveillance and data theft that was so sophisticated and invasive that it fundamentally changed how I think about privacy in retail environments and the vulnerability we all face when we carry connected devices into public spaces. This incident began on a Thursday evening around 7 p.m. when I stopped at Walmart with my friend Jessica after we had finished our shifts at the hospital. We were both exhausted from a particularly challenging day in the pediatric ICU, and we decided to grab some groceries and household items before heading home. Jessica had been having problems with her smartphone. Random apps crashing, unusual battery drain, and slower performance than normal. So, I was helping her troubleshoot the issues while we shopped. As we moved through the store, I was periodically checking Jessica's phone to see if I could identify what was causing her technical problems. I've always been the person my friends and family turn to for tech support, and I enjoy the puzzle-solving aspect of diagnosing electronic issues. What I discovered during this casual troubleshooting session was far more sinister than a simple software glitch or hardware malfunction. The first red flag appeared when I checked Jessica's location services to see which apps were tracking her movements. Her phone showed that she had been checked in at this particular Walmart location for over 3 hours, even though we had only been in the store for about 20 minutes. This was impossible unless her phone had been connecting to location services from this store while she was at work, which didn't make sense given that the hospital was several miles away, and she hadn't been near this Walmart at any point during her shift. When I dug deeper into her phone's connection history, I found that her device had automatically connected to a Wi-Fi network called free Wi-Fi that neither of us had authorized or even noticed. This network wasn't listed among the store's official customer Wi-Fi options, and it didn't require the typical login process that most retail establishments use for their guest internet access. The connection had been established without any notification or permission request, which is highly unusual for legitimate Wi-Fi networks. My suspicion that something wasn't right intensified when I discovered that this unauthorized Wi-Fi connection had been used to access Jessica's personal data. Her phone's activity log showed that while connected to this free Wi-Fi network, there had been data transfers involving her photo gallery, contact list, text message history, and even her email accounts. The timestamps indicated that this data access had occurred during our current shopping trip, meaning that someone was actively mining information from her device while we were in the store. I immediately checked my own phone and discovered that the same thing was happening to my device. I had also been automatically connected to the free Wi-Fi network without my knowledge or consent, and there was evidence of unauthorized access to my personal information. The sophistication of this data harvesting operation was alarming. It wasn't just grabbing basic information like contact details, but was accessing private communications, financial apps, and even stored passwords that could be used for identity theft. As someone who works in healthcare, I'm particularly sensitive to privacy violations because of the strict regulations we follow regarding patient confidentiality and data security. I understand the legal and ethical implications of unauthorized access to personal information. And I recognized that what was happening to our phones was potentially criminal activity that could affect hundreds or thousands of other customers who might not have the technical knowledge to detect what was occurring. I decided to document what we had discovered and immediately reported the situation to store management. I explained that there appeared to be an unauthorized Wi-Fi network operating in their store that was stealing personal data from customers' devices without their knowledge or consent. I provided specific technical details about the network configuration and the types of data that were being accessed, hoping that this information would prompt immediate action to investigate and shut down the operation. The initial response from store management was dismissive and concerning. The assistant manager I spoke with claimed that they had no knowledge of any free Wi-Fi network and suggested that what I was describing was probably just a technical glitch or misunderstanding of how modern smartphones connect to internet services. When I insisted that this was deliberate data theft and showed him the evidence on our phones, he seemed more interested in avoiding liability than addressing the security breach. When I mentioned that I was considering contacting local news media and law enforcement about the privacy violations, the manager's attitude changed dramatically. Suddenly, he was very interested in resolving the situation quietly and asked what it would take to satisfy my concerns without involving outside authorities. This response was extremely telling, suggesting that store management was aware of the unauthorized data collection and was more concerned about preventing negative publicity than protecting their customers' privacy and security. I refused to be bought off or intimidated into silence about what amounted to systematic theft of personal information from unsuspecting customers. I told the manager that I intended to file reports with appropriate authorities regardless of any offers or promises from the store, and that other customers had the right to know that their personal data was being compromised when they shopped at this location. Over the following days, I conducted my own investigation into the scope of this privacy violation. I posted warnings on my social media accounts, describing what had happened and advising people to check their phones for unauthorized Wi-Fi connections and suspicious data activity after visiting this particular Walmart location. The response was overwhelming and disturbing. Dozens of people replied that they had experienced similar issues after shopping at the same store. Many of the people who contacted me reported problems that they hadn't initially connected to their Walmart visits. Unexplained charges on credit cards that had been used at the store, spam emails and text messages that started after shopping trips, and even cases of identity theft where personal information had been used to open unauthorized accounts or make fraudulent purchases. The pattern was clear and consistent, indicating that this wasn't an isolated technical problem, but a systematic operation designed to harvest and exploit customer data. I filed formal complaints with the Federal Trade Commission, the Arizona Attorney General's Office, and local law enforcement. I provided detailed technical documentation of the data theft, along with contact information for other affected customers who were willing to serve as witnesses or provide additional evidence. I also reached out to cybersecurity experts and consumer protection organizations to ensure that the appropriate authorities were aware of the sophistication and scope of the operation. The investigation that followed revealed that the free Wi-Fi network was indeed unauthorized and was being operated by individuals who had installed equipment designed to intercept and steal data from customers' mobile devices. The setup was highly sophisticated, using technology that could automatically connect to smartphones and access personal information without triggering the security warnings that most people rely on to protect their privacy. What was most disturbing about this discovery was learning that the data theft operation had been running for months, potentially affecting thousands of customers who had no idea their personal information had been compromised. The stolen data was being used for various criminal purposes, including identity theft, credit card fraud, and the creation of detailed profiles that could be sold to other criminal organizations or used for targeted scams and harassment. The store's response to the investigation was inadequate and focused primarily on damage control rather than customer protection or accountability. While they cooperated with law enforcement to remove the unauthorized equipment, they made no effort to notify affected customers about the privacy breach or provide assistance to people who had suffered financial losses as a result of the data theft. Several individuals involved in the operation were eventually arrested and charged with various cybercrime offenses. But the legal process was lengthy, and many victims never recovered the money they lost to identity theft and fraud. The case highlighted significant gaps in consumer protection laws and the difficulty of prosecuting sophisticated cybercrimes that target large numbers of victims over extended periods. The psychological impact of discovering that my personal information had been stolen in such a systematic and invasive way was significant. I felt violated and vulnerable in a way that was different from traditional crimes like burglary or theft. The idea that criminals could access my private communications, financial information, and personal photos simply by being in the same building as me was terrifying and made me reconsider how I use technology in public spaces. I now take extensive precautions to protect my digital privacy when shopping or visiting any public location. I turn off automatic Wi-Fi connections, use VPN services to encrypt my internet traffic, and regularly monitor my accounts for signs of unauthorized access or suspicious activity. These precautions are time-consuming and shouldn't be necessary for basic activities like grocery shopping, but they've become essential given the sophisticated nature of modern privacy threats. This experience taught me that digital privacy violations can happen anywhere, and that criminals are constantly developing new methods to exploit our dependence on connected devices. The fact that this operation was conducted in a busy retail store, targeting ordinary customers who were simply trying to shop for necessities, demonstrates that no one is immune to these threats and that we all need to be more vigilant about protecting our personal information. The most troubling aspect of this entire situation was the realization that most people would never have discovered what was happening to their devices and personal data if I hadn't been troubleshooting Jessica's phone problems with my technical background. We might never have detected the unauthorized access, and the data theft could have continued indefinitely without our knowledge. If you've experienced similar technical problems with your devices after visiting retail locations, or if you've noticed unexplained charges or suspicious activity on your accounts, I encourage you to investigate further and report your findings to appropriate authorities. These crimes rely on victims not realizing what's happening to them, and the only way to stop them is through awareness and collective action. Please share this story and others like it to help protect your friends and family from similar privacy violations. Subscribe to Verified Fears for more true stories that expose the hidden dangers we all face in everyday situations. Only by bringing these threats to light can we hope to protect ourselves and our communities from those who would exploit our trust and vulnerability for their own criminal purposes.